first thing that we're going to do is to finish up Jerusalem. Now, Jerusalem and the Old City, again, as the World Heritage Site, has 4 quarters, and I'm sure that most of you have been there. So how did the Armenians get a quarter? Well, it's because they asked for a $50 and they got shortchanged? No, okay. It's because Armenia has had a Christian presence since Christianity was brought to Armenia in the 4th century. They then would send pilgrims to the Holy Land and to Ottoman Jerusalem at the time. The quarter would be then given by the Ottoman Turkish Empire as a place of refuge and a place of pilgrimage hospitality for the Armenians making their way to the Holy Land. But the quarter wouldn't come into its own until the Armenian genocides at the beginning of the 20th century under the Ottoman Turks, around the period of the second decade of the 20th century into World War I. It's also the smallest of the 4 quarters, but it's distinct from the Christian quarter, even though the Armenians are Christian themselves. They are very staunch in terms of their independency, and they have maintained the integrity of their quarter for well over a century. And they're most noted for the Jerusalem style of pottery, Armenian pottery, a tradition and technique that they brought with them from Armenia centuries ago. And there you can see it at the southwest corner of the Old City. The Christian quarter is situated in the northwestern area of the Old City. And as we mentioned last week, the new gate would be created and opened so it would allow direct access into the northern part of the Christian quarter. Again, Jaffa was the entrance into the southern end as well. And here on the east, it borders the Muslim quarter, just about in the area where the Damascus Gate is located today. This quarter contains the Via Dolorosa, the Way of Sorrows, and the last 4 stations of the cross of the Way of Sorrows, located inside the precinct of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And to Christians all over the world, they believe that this is the holiest place in all of Christendom. On the left, you can see the main Crusader entry built in the 11th century to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And on the lower right, you can see one of the slabs that is venerated as the location where Jesus's body was laid and cleansed in preparation for final interment. The Muslim quarter is the largest and today the most populated of the 4 quarters, located on the northeastern side. It extends from the Lion's Gate along the eastern wall of the Old City, down to the northern perimeter wall of the Temple Mount complex, and then the main roads from the Damascus Gate west to David Street to the southeast. About 15 years ago, its population was well over 22,000. And it also has a mixed population. Christians and Jews were living in this quarter up until the riots of 1929. These are some of the markets that you find in the Muslim quarter. And you should all be glad that, as Jeremy and I were talking before we let you guys in, be glad that the screens aren't in smell-o-vision, because there is a meat market street And up until the late 1970s, many of those butcher shops were open air, were not refrigerated because people came and bought their meat on a daily basis. And this led to unsanitary conditions that the Israeli government then began to modify. But on the lower left, it's too bad that this is in the smell-o-vision, because this is one of the spice markets in the old city, and the fragrances and aromas of dozens of different kinds of spices make it a mouth-watering oral sensation. The Temple Mount itself has a series of entries from the Muslim quarter, and on the north you have the Bab el-Asmat, the northern gate that leads directly to the minaret at the northeastern corner of the Temple Mount that would serve to cause the faithful to prayer. In addition, along the perimeter of the Temple Mount, you also find a couple of madrasas, or Islamic schools, considered to be the most venerated in all of the Holy Land. Then we come to the Temple Mount itself. And Jared Brock would say, what are the chances that all of the 1.59 quadrillion square feet of land on this earth, 3 major world religions are fighting over a single rock? Mount Moriah, the sacred precinct, the Temple Mount. At the heart of the Old City and at the heart of the World Heritage Sites in Jerusalem is the Temple Mount precinct. And you can see the close proximity when it comes to all faiths. Just to the left of the image, you would find the Church of the Holy Sepulchre about a 5-minute walk away. On the Temple Mount today, you have got the Dome of the Rock, the Haram Sharif, which is in the upper left. On the upper right, you have the faraway mosque called Al-Aqsa in Arabic. And then below, its center stage for us all, is the Western Wall. And I've got to stress that this is the Western retaining wall of the Temple Mount, not the Western Wall of the temple itself. Prior to 1967, the Western Wall was in the heart of the Old City and the Muslim population, because this is where the Muslim quarter came to an end, at the base of the Western Wall. There were dozens of houses, public and private buildings, that literally ran up to about 15 feet away from the wall, as you can see in the upper photograph on the upper right. But following the reunification of the city and the '67 war, these buildings were purchased by the Israeli government. The populations relocated within the old city, and then the buildings removed because of Israel appreciating the fact that there would be thousands of visitors every day visiting the Western Wall, whether they were tourists or the faithful. And so a plaza needed to be created. Why is the Western Wall so important? Why is it considered to be so sanctified? Because according to Jewish tradition, this area of the Western Wall is the closest location to where the Holy of Holies, the Devir, in the temple stood up on the Temple Mount. It is, the wall itself is not sacred, and it is no more sacred than the other retaining walls, but it takes on its holiness because of its close proximity to where the temple stood on top of the Temple Mount before it was finally destroyed in the year 70 of this era. This is the way that the Western Wall and its plaza area looked in the first 2/3 of the 20th century. You can see members of the British military and the British mandatory governmental representatives in the upper right-hand photo. And in the lower photo, you can then see the close proximity of the private houses that then ran adjacent. In 1967, with the reunification of the city, the plaza would be created. And I thought that this was really apt because one of Israel's great photographers and wartime photographers took this picture on the June the 5th, 1967, of 3 Israeli paratroopers at the Western Wall. He was able to track down those paratroopers and have them take the same basic pose at the wall 50 years later. And I thought that was great. And if you look at the guy on the left, he simply transplanted what hair he had on his head down to his chin, right? But you can see that they're all the same fellows. And that's truly amazing. Today, the Golani Brigade of Israel, after its basic training, comes to the Western Wall to take its oath and to celebrate its induction into the Golani Brigade. And I was fortunate enough to be at one of those occurrences that takes place at sunset during the summer months. And if you can't make it to the Western Wall today, modern technology will allow you to have a cell phone where you can speak directly to God, because they say that your prayers at the Western Wall go from your mouth to God's ears. And if you can't be there with your mouth, you've got a Motorola flip phone, I guess. And I just said that. Again, it is the holiest place in Judaism today. And there are thousands and thousands of notes of remembrance and prayer that are stuffed between the cracks of this wall. And I thought this was fascinating. What happens to all these notes? Well, twice a year, the rabbi of the Western Wall Authority, today is Shmuel Rabinovitz, and his team then comes and collects these notes and prayers and then buries them in a geniza on the Mount of Olives, just a couple of 100 meters away. I thought that this was fascinating. For the Christian community, it is from the northern edge of the Temple Mount. Today, where the El Omariya Arabic Boys School for English Language is located, that you find the Via Dolorosa, the Way of Sorrows, following the final journey of Jesus through the streets of Jerusalem to his and others' crucifixion, which today is located in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. The last 4 stations of the cross, 10 through 14, are located within the perimeter of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And the Emperor Constantine, at the urging of his mother, Queen Helena, would make a pilgrimage and would dedicate a church on the location that she would identify as the traditional spot of the crucifixion and the burial of Jesus. And you notice that today, the Via Dolorosa is well within the city limits of the old city. That's because during the 1st century of this era, at the end of Herodian Judea and the period of time of the prefects of Judea under the Roman Empire, you find that the city wall of the northern edge of Jerusalem ran just along the area where the Via Dolorosa runs today. And if the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is supposedly at the location of the burial place of Jesus, we know that Jewish cemeteries were all outside of the city limits, and therefore the Church of the Holy Sepulchre was outside of Jerusalem 2,000 years ago. Again, The main entry, dated to the period of the Crusaders, of the 12th century of this era. The 14th station, inside this magnificent church, is the rotunda. And the rotunda is above a structure called the edicula, which is, according to some Christian traditions, the actual tomb of Jesus. It was built in the 4th century, but then in 1810, the Greek Orthodox Church rebuilt the edicula in the Baroque style. It is a stunningly beautiful structure, and there is always a waiting line of 20 to 30 minutes to get in, because many Christians consider it to be the holiest place in Christendom. This then is the edicula and the entrance to it. Here you can see a marble slab that marks the burial place according to the Greek Orthodox Church. And all of those ceramic things above are, in fact, incense burners and censers. When we talk about the Temple Mount for the Muslim community, two structures come to mind instantly. You've got the Dome of the Rock, the nicknamed the Mosque of Omar, although it's not a mosque. And then you've got the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Arabic, which means the faraway mosque. This is the actual location where services are conducted for the Islamic faith. Now, it would be in 638 that Jerusalem would be occupied by the Muslim armies under the Caliph Omar. And he would then proclaim Jerusalem Al-Quds in Arabic, which means the holy, marking it as the third holiest place in Islam. The octagonal dome would serve as a monument on the Temple Mount, but it has been colloquially nicknamed the Mosque of Omar. And this is the way that it looks today. Ah, the wonders of technology. According to Islamic tradition, this noble sanctuary of this octagonal structure was built over the location where, in a dream, Muhammad made a night sojourn to meet with God, to meet with Allah. And he would then fly from Jerusalem on horseback, on his horse Burak, and sit at the right-hand side of God. The dome was originally covered with glass mosaics, but then in the 11th century, prior to the Crusader conquest of Jerusalem, it would be gilded. But as I say, sometimes all that glitters isn't gold. In February of 2003, I was lucky enough to be visiting Israel, and there was a snowstorm. They had a whopping 20 centimeters of snow fall in the city of Jerusalem. And of course, everybody went outside to make snowmen. But for the Palestinians, they had a Yasser Arafat lookalike contest. No, just kidding. And this snowman has been dubbed Yasser Arafat by the Palestinian sculptor, and you can see the keffiyeh on his head. From Jerusalem, we move just about a 30-minute drive to the south. And today it is part of the Palestinian Authority territories. But when it was created as a World Heritage Site, it was a World Heritage nominated site by the Jordanians. But finally, in 2012, the Church of the Nativity complex would be listed as the very first Palestinian site on the World Heritage list. But at the time of its nomination, it was not considered to be part of the Palestinian Authority. It was a controversial decision, both on its technical and political terms, yet it remains the only Palestinian site today as part of the World Heritage Organization. The church was commissioned by the Emperor Constantine in 327 after his mother would also identify a cavern that she thought was the traditional location of the birth of Jesus. The original basilica was completed just a couple of years later, but it was destroyed in the 6th century of this era, only to be rebuilt by the Emperor Justinian around 565. Now, this basilica has maintained its primary footprint, and it's only in the latter part of the Crusader era of the 13th century that the apse would be converted to an octagonal shape, as you see in the upper right footprint or plan of the building. The basilica itself is a rectangle that's nearly 54 meters in length and 26 meters wide. In antiquity, originally, there was nothing in terms of Bethlehem surrounding it, so it was in the middle of open fields, but today you can see how Bethlehem has grown up around the Church of the Nativity, and in the front, you can see in the lower right center of the picture of the circle, a large plaza that's been called, yes, Manger Square. It's all made of a reddish white limestone that's called Mitzi Achmar, which is quarried in the Judean hills, not too far away. The main entrance would be redesigned and modified by the Crusaders. The Crusaders themselves are not always the good guys that we consider in the movies. The Crusaders were a rough and tumble series of adventurers, pillagers, military men, and to a lesser degree, holy men. The Crusades were only partially revolving around spirituality. The other part was a means of pillaging the Far East of some of its wealth and riches that had been indicated for centuries since the Muslim conquest. Now, many of the Crusaders couldn't drink the water because they were in a foreign land. So what did they do? They drank wine, mulled wine, and lots of it. And oftentimes the Crusaders, after rediscovering the Church of the Nativity in a drunken state, would ride right into the Church of the Nativity and into the area of the nave before dismounting and paying their spiritual respects to the location considered to be the birthplace of Jesus. But the religious authorities decided that they would modify the entrance to the church. And if you see in the right-hand picture, you can see the original arch and vault that since had been stoned up during the later 12th and early 13th centuries, only to create this much smaller doorway. And how small was it? There you can see that people need to bend over because it's only about 4 feet high. This meant that a crusader needed to tether his horse outside, dismount, and if he was sober enough, bend over low enough to enter into the Church of the Nativity. If not, he had a rude awakening by bopping his head on the lintel that was above. And then here you can see it from the inside as you're walking out of the Church of the Nativity. So I thought that was a fascinating story. The main basilica shows us that it is a 5-aisle structure with the apse on the eastern end and the sanctuary. Here you can see at the end of the apse where the altar and services are conducted, there is a 3-step riser that takes you into the sacred precinct. And because it is Orthodox in nature, all of the columns have beautiful icons that are either hung on them or painted on them. And you can see the myriad of chalices and incense burners that are suspended from the ceiling as part and parcel of the Eastern Orthodox brand of Christian spirituality. Here are some of the beautifully gilded icons that are part of the iconostasis. Now, an icon in the Orthodox Church is considered to be a window into heaven. It is not something that you pray to, but something that you pray through to become as godly as possible. Because people were non-literate in antiquity, the use of imagery as a classics illustrated version of the Bible is how these icons were used to enhance the holiness of the faithful. The wooden rafters of the rebuilt, modified, and restored ceiling are about 6 centuries old, and they were donated by King Edward IV of England in the 1470s. And they are the same wooden beams today. They are covered in lead, or were covered in lead by King Edward IV. But the lead was removed by the Ottoman Turks, and they melted down this lead to use it for ammunition in the war against Venice, the Second Venetian War, which took place at the end of the 15th and the beginning of the 16th centuries. The original Roman era or Byzantine mosaic floor has been discovered during renovations and excavations. It is beneath the slab floor, the stone slab floor created by the Crusaders. And today there are parts of this more ancient Byzantine floor, the mosaics visible, as you can see, left in the floor of the basilica today. Stairs on either side of the sanctuary lead down to a series of grottos and different entrances. And according to Christian tradition, in one of these grottos, Jesus is said to have been born. On the surface, in the apse, you can see the exact spot is noted by a 14-point silver star surrounded by incense burners and lamps. And there is a hole that has been drilled to allow the faithful, prior to this grotto being open to the general public, of peering down into it, into the grotto where Mary laid the firstborn, the newborn child, Jesus. Below on the lower left is that grotto according to tradition. One of the other grottos is designated the Grotto of St. Jerome, and according to tradition, this is where St. Jerome spent 30 years translating the Hebrew Bible into Greek and then into Latin. There is another cavern on the left at the bottom of the stairs called the Chapel of the Innocents, where, according to Christian tradition, King Herod would bury a series of infants who were killed because he was afraid of the warning that he was given that the King of the Jews would be born in the year 4 BCE. However, there have been no remains that have been found, and this is more of a narrative story rather than having any signs of actual proof and evidence. In 2010, the Palestinian Authority announced that they would undergo a multi-million-dollar restoration process. And this is an ongoing process where, as you can see in the upper right, windows that were hundreds of years old, that were leaking, that were rotting, would be replaced. as well as the restoration of the roof that also was leaking in place as well. This is an aerial view of the Church of the Nativity as it looks today. But then this is probably the way that it looked 2,000 years ago in an open field with a very, very small village just adjacent to it. From there, we move to a series of 4 archaeological sites that are all lumped together. And if you recall weeks ago when we began our journey together, we looked at 3 all sites that were linked together as part of the monarchy of ancient Israel of David and Solomon. Well, here you have 4 sites in the Negev that are part of the Nabatean spice routes, trade routes that ran from their capital of Petra in southeastern Jordan all the way to the Mediterranean coast. And it would be up to this group of Arabs, the Nabatean Arabs, to control these spice routes and trade routes for hundreds of years until they were finally conquered and annexed by the Roman Empire in the year 106 of this era. Here you can see that there were 4 of these spice routes, caravanserais or caravan inns that are located along the Negev and the Arava of southern Israel. If you can see my arrow here, Petra is located on the southeast of this satellite map, and then the trade route would run directly across the eastern and western Negev to the Mediterranean coast in the area of the Gaza district today, just south of Ashdod and Ashkelon. Here you can see then the capital city of Petra, located in the heart of southern Jordan. But these Nabatean trade routes that they guarded and protected ran all the way through the Arabian Peninsula to the Indian Ocean. And the spices that they would control in terms of the overland trade routes came from as far east as the subcontinent of India, and then ran through the Negev until you got to the Mediterranean. And there we go. These are the sites. You've got Haluza, Mamshit, Shivta, and Avdat. They would be declared part of the World Heritage Spice Routes Caravan in 2005. The smallest of these is Mamshit, also known as Kurnam. It's located just about 2/3 of the way from Beersheba in the heart of the western Negev to the site of Petra, located to the southeast. The earliest indication that we have of the site of Mamshit can be found on the mosaic map of Medeba, created by the Emperor Justinian just around 565 of this era. Medeba is located in southern Jordan, along the slopes of Mount Nebo, overlooking the Dead Sea. This map shows us the biblical world all the way from the canopic branch of the Nile to the northeast to the Tigris and the Euphrates valleys. And the heart and soul and the center of this ancient map was Jerusalem, the site of Mamsis. In Greek, here, Mamshit, can be seen in this close-up. Now, the town plan of Mamshit gives us a wonderful idea about how the Nabateans were able to thrive, not just survive, in the Negev desert. They would create a series of dams across the dried riverbeds that run through the heart of the biblical Negev. And in the winter months, when there would be rainfall in the Negev, they would then capture and dam up the water in these wadis or dried riverbeds, and then hand fill cisterns so that water would be made available for several months throughout the rest of the year, because the water didn't absorb into the ground for a number of weeks because it was so hard packed and dry. Here you can see on the left one of those Nabatean dams adjacent to Mamshit. It would first be discovered by Ulrich Seetzen in 1806, who disguised himself as Musa al-Hakim, Moses the Doctor. He was one of the earliest Europeans to venture into the heart and soul of the Arab world. He would later be killed in Yemen, trying to escape with looted artifacts. His work would eventually be published. Here you can see the perimeter wall of the city and one of the main gates located right on the northern side of the city. This is viewing on the top from the outside in and then from the inside out. Today, Mamshit has been beautifully preserved and in parts restored by the National Parks Authority. Again, they're not trying to pull the socks over your eyes. They're not trying to fool you into thinking that this is the original state, but rather restoration of archaeological sites is designed to give you a better handle of what the ancient city looked like and felt like to the viewers, the tourists, the visitors of these sites. Because if you can walk into buildings by stepping over walls, you don't get a sense of what the houses, the rooms were like. So if you look very carefully in the upper picture here and in the lower picture right here, you can see a faint black line. This shows you the reconstruction and the restoration of the site to raise the walls so you're forced to go through doorways and passageways rather than step over the remains of walls. One of the two-story towers, the only two-story structures in the building, in the city, has been restored, and there's an observation point on the top today. The caravanserai, or caravan inn, the stables, took up a considerable portion of the site because, again, the Nabataeans were involved in the world's oldest profession. Oh, I see some of you. Don't look at me like that. That's the second oldest profession. The world's oldest profession is guarding caravan routes and trade routes. The second oldest profession followed along the caravan routes and trade routes. So the world's oldest profession, guarding and protecting caravans, was the basic employment opportunity of the Nabataeans, and therefore the stables for those caravans passing through their fortress cities were a major part of their economy. Later on in the Nabatean period, many of the buildings show you the wealth of these fortresses by including beautiful fresco work along the walls, which had been discovered by Nachman Avigad of the Hebrew University and preserved, not restored today. So those beautiful fresco images are originals. From there, we come to the ancient site of Shivta, known as Sabota in Greek, or Subeta. The Arab community would call it Isbeta, and it's located just about 40 kilometers southeast of the city of Beersheba today, in the heart of the transition from the western to the eastern Negev desert. It's over 81,000 square meters in size, and it didn't have a city wall, but rather all of the buildings were attached with a communal wall that then allowed them to be entered from within the city, thus forming a ring of defense around the city, something that's unique in the Nabatean world. Now, it would be here that some of the most exciting archaeology and espionage would take place. Just before World War I, two archaeologists, British archaeologists, would arrive at Shivta, uh, ostensibly to plot it, survey it, and map it. But there was another reason as well. These two gentlemen, T.E. Lawrence, also known as Lawrence of Arabia, and Charles Leonard Woolley, a British archaeologist, would be employed by the British government to serve sort of undercover as spies, because they were allowed into the archaeological sites that were part of the Ottoman Turkish Empire at the time, and they would write all sorts of dispatches that would be encoded and sent back to England, marking Turkish troop movements prior to the war. On the right, you've got Woolley, and on the left of the right-hand black and white picture, you've got the real T.E. Lawrence. But on the left, you've got Omar Sharif and Peter O'Toole from the movie. And now you can see a reason why they chose Peter O'Toole to portray Lawrence, because he really did look a lot like T.E. Lawrence. Once again, water would be at the premium, and the Nabateans showed their ingenuity because most of the houses had roof drains on them, and these roof drains ran into stone and limestone covered canals that ran to various cisterns, as you can see in the two pictures here. So whenever it rained, the water from the roofs of these buildings would all be gathered and then stored for the dry season. And there you can see them, another one as well. You can see then the beautiful architectural sculptures that we find as part and parcel of this Nabatean world that began as early as the 4th century BCE and continued through the first part of the 2nd century, just prior to Roman occupation. From there, we move to the site of Haluza, known as Al-Halasa or Elusa in the New Testamental Synoptic Gospels. Because of its historic importance, it was made part of this World Heritage location, even though excavations were few and far between. They would finally be carried out by Tel Aviv University. Here you can see then the excavations that were carried out in the late 1970s by Tel Aviv University. You can see part of a theater that would be excavated as well, and that was called an Odeon, which is a small theater. Found in the debris was a beautiful dedicatory inscription written in Greek. During the governorship of the most magnificent and most glorious Flavius Demarchus was made the pavement of the old theater up to the old pavement by the charge of the citizen Abramius, son of Zenobius, in the year 349. So this is part of the renewed city utilized by the Romans after the fall of the Nabatean Empire. And from there, we go to the site of Avdat, probably the most impressive, most beautifully preserved and restored Nabatean fortress city to be found anywhere outside of Petra. It's on a ridge that rises 80 meters, which is close to 250 feet, around the surrounding plain of the Eastern Negev. It was founded in the 1st century BCE by the Nabatean king Abodas, and it was then named after Abodas, who also took the name of a Nabatean deity, Avdat. So Abodas I, the king, was also named after a Nabatean deity, Avdat. The city has a beautifully preserved central fortress and caravanserai or caravan inn. Only parts of the Nabatean city and the later Roman city have been excavated and preserved, as you can see in the left-hand picture. There is also a Roman fortress, part of the Limes Arabica, which was the Roman fortress line that served to protect against Egypt to the south. And here you can see the heights of the Nabatean caravanserai in the right-hand picture. This aerial view shows you the caravanserai as excavated and restored by the Reshut Ganim, the National Parks Authority, surrounded by the Nabatean city. The entrance to the Khan or the caravanserai has been preserved and partially restored, as you can see here. There are ongoing excavations today at Avdat, as well as preservation endeavors. A wine press was beautifully reconstructed and preserved that was located just outside of the caravanserai or caravan inn. And here's the fortress's main gate from both the inside and the outside view. You can see it in the brighter circle. Beneath the major courtyards, especially the easternmost one, were enormous underground cisterns that could hold tens of thousands of gallons of water, not just from rainfall or from hand-filled other sources, but you can also see the aqueduct that ran from the perimeter walls and the roof that was plastered and waterproof into the cistern so that during the winter months of rain, it could fill to capacity. This is the small postern gate located on the north wall. And the caravanserai was separated into two courtyards. At the southern end is a portico, and it shows you part of the Nabatean unique style of architecture. The columns were all stone drum columns, not monolithic columns, that were plastered over. But then notice, at the top of the columns, you can see carved into the last, as part of the last stone drum, a platform. This platform allowed for the wooden beams of the roof system to rest firmly and securely on top of the columns to anchor and strengthen the roof system. This is unique, as far as I know, in the ancient world. From there, we find a temple complex located at the southern end of the fortress and caravan inn. Here you can see an elaborate entry that leads to the podium, and it affords a spectacular view of the eastern Negev. It was dedicated originally to two gods, Dushara and Alat, but then it was also dedicated to all the friends of Obotus, the king, dated 268, showing that the temple was rededicated by the Romans to Zeus Obotus. So the Romans continued the use of this building as a sacred precinct. Avram Negev, one of the chief excavators of the Hebrew University, would find this dedicatory inscription, as you can see on the right. Those then are the sites of the Nabataeans and of Bethlehem. I'm glad that you're going to join us for one more week, where we will look at maybe briefly Beit Guvrin caves and then spend most of our time at the World Heritage Site of Masada. But meanwhile, Jeremy, if there are any questions, I'm happy to answer them. If there are any answers, you can be sure that I'll question them.
I don't seem to see anybody with their hand up for you, Dr. D.
So that means that it was either crystal clear or it was so confusing they don't even know enough to ask a question.
Actually, people look a little drowsy.
Oh, yeah?
No, it was wonderful. Thank you so much. I appreciate all your time and effort, and I appreciate everybody joining us today. It means a lot to me and to Federation. So
And remember, it's Wednesday, not Tuesday.
yes, and I will be sending a reminder out like I always do. Oh, and just so you know, we now have a YouTube channel. Oh, Gail wants a question, but
Okay.
we are going to have a YouTube channel with all the recordings. I know not everybody could make it, but everybody does want to hear and listen to Dr. D. So Gail, I will unmute you for your question.
I would like Steve to, I'm curious about the ethics while digging up old bones.
Ah, the ethics of digging up old bones. Well, it all depends. How's that? The fact is that ever since the 1970s or so, in the latest revolution of archaeological methods and techniques, should a cemetery or an unexpected cemetery, in other words, bones of an individual that were not buried deliberately, but accident or not finding them, be discovered, that is part and parcel of an archaeological and historical heritage. They should be examined, they should be excavated, but then they should have one of two things done. If they are identifiable, not necessarily as the individual, but in terms of a particular culture that still exists. For example, at Beersheba, when I was part of a team in 1971 that discovered a Turkish soldier at the site of Beersheba who had been caught in the shelling of the British in World War I. We were able to box up his remains and his personal possessions, and we delivered them to the Turkish embassy.
Wow.
Because this was a modern, and put that in quotes, burial, and we were able to identify him because he still had his wallet.
Oh my
I mean,
goodness.
I was a newbie. It was my first year of digging. This almost took me out of the world of archaeology because it's scary. I mean, I have excavated a couple of dozen burials since then. But if they don't have clothes on them, if they don't have uniforms, if they don't have a wallet with a picture of the wife and kids, that's bones. But here, with a photograph of the wife and kids, it was 100, now it's 100 years old. Back then, all right, this is giving up how old? It was only 65 years old. That's freaky. Because he still had part of his uniform on.
What about the ones from the caves that you showed us?
Okay, hang on. I'm almost there. But in modernity, if it's a, quote, modern burial of the last couple of 100 years or something, if there is somewhere you can send the remains after you have boxed them up or put them in a coffin, respectfully, you do that. In terms of ancient remains, if there are no relatives, and you're talking about some of the bones, for example, that we found in the Carmel caves, 100,000 years old, those bones can be studied, can be analyzed, but then we rebury them with a sense of respect and dignity away from an archaeological site. We find that today, the Smithsonian, Harvard, all institutions, especially regarding Native Americans, who have collections of bones that are 100, 125 years old. That was the rule when they would discover them in the late 1880s and 1890s to put them in the labs of museums. But today they are repatriating them to the various tribal authorities so that their ancestors can be reburied, even though they may not have an identity.
So I'm sorry, Gail, I've got some other people that want to ask questions. So we'll come back. But Ronnie, one question before you. Dave asked, can you say more about the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem being under Palestinian control?
I could, but I won't. That would be part of something that we call the Arab-Israeli conflict, 100 years war, twice promised land that we may be doing sometime in the future. Under the auspices today of the Palestinian Authority, they are the ones who control the site and work in conjunction with the World Heritage Organization.
Great, thank you. That was very diplomatic. Ronnie, you're all you.
Thank you. How does a place become a World Heritage Site? For example, I'm thinking of in Bethlehem. When I was there, I went to see the tomb, Rachel's tomb. Why is that not a World Heritage Site, for example?
That's a good question. Why aren't thousands of places around the world World Heritage Sites? Countries need to nominate an archaeological site to UNESCO. And UNESCO every year has a conclave. During the previous year, they will pour through the applications. They will do site visits. They will analyze, and they will look at the application. Then the World Heritage UNESCO authorities will vote on it. And sometimes sites are deferred for a later year if too many sites have been nominated in a given year. It's entirely political, not negatively political. It's because nation states, as part of the UN, UNESCO is an arm of the UN, and the nation states will propose what they consider to be important sites that they don't have all of the wherewithal to preserve and protect. And the World Heritage Organization, in fact, helps by funding and conservation expertise to protect these sites.
Mm-hmm.
So that's that in terms of that being political, nothing in terms of politics political, if you know what I mean. So it depends on the country. There are a couple of dozen Native American sites in the United States that should be listed in the World Heritage. But you've got Monticello, for example, and the University of Virginia, designed by Thomas Jefferson as part of World Heritage. Do you see it? So it's a hunt and peck system, but it's all up to the host countries to initiate the process. The UN, UNESCO organization does not say, send us an application for this particular site. So it's up to the governments.
Okay, so one more question before we leave. Gail, you had one more.
I just wanted to ask Steve if he would consider teaching a class on Morocco, because I know he was going to lead a trip there.
That's entirely up to the
Gail,
gods and goddesses of Federation.
Gail, we're looking for sponsors, so after we're done here, I will be contacting you. Thank you for your inquiry. I really appreciate that.
Jeremy and I have talked about a number of Zoomies.
Yes.
And even when all of this nightmare has light at the end of the tunnel, especially if we get back on track in terms of the Federation building and campus, there won't be the kind of facilities available even after the pandemic eases, when we start to build and remodel and all that stuff. So I think that this is a great way to keep people engaged and active. And as I said at the beginning, my father of blessed memory said, when you stop learning, you're dead. So
Yep.
It's nice to see all of you, all originally 68 of you who had signed on that are still alive.
Oh, you know, I
Of
just
course, I
want to
did have a teacher
What?
in high school who was dead, but somebody forgot to tell him. He was that bad.
I can tell you the number of people registered for this class for today's was 168. More than half came, and I know that many of the people are signed up to receive the link to watch it later on. So thank you very much, Dr. D.
It's a
Appreciate
tribute
it.
to all of you guys.
Thank you all.